Good evening, everyone. Today we're going to start discussing again on the week 11 content of related to papers. So, today we're going to talk about this larger phenomenon, and then inside this larger phenomenon, we talk about two specific cases. And the larger phenomenon we want to talk about today goes around that online actions which you take do have offline impacts. So, a lot of you would a lot of you would identify this person. His name is Yashaj Mukhote. During COVID, he got very famous for making music-related short video contents on Instagram and other platforms. And through that virality and famous, today he's been working with some of the greatest musicians of all time. Uh, these effects can also be negative at times, which is you would also must have seen a lot of Snapchats or Instagrams like this in your time where people are driving and at the same time they are making a video about it. Okay. And there has been multiple cases of people doing this and in the process ended up having accidents, had major injuries, and in some very unfortunate cases, people also passed away. So that is to say that there are a lot of implications of what somebody does online can have like a lot of implications in their offline world, and there is value in being able to quantify this effect, that how is this impact happening, uh, who is this impact happening to, when and where does these actions take place, and can we suggest interventions which can help, let's say, reduce the harm and help us improve the good things about these effects. Okay. And in that process, today we would discuss two papers. These two papers try to do this same thing, where they look at an online event and they try to understand something about their offline impact. The first one would be the effect of popularity shocks on user behavior. This was part of ICWSM 2022. It is from Lab Precog. And the other one is also from Precog, which is from ICWSM 2020, which talks about dangerous driving incidents called driving the last mile, characterizing and understanding distracted driving posts on social networks. Any questions if you have before we move forward? Okay, great.
Um,
Yeah.
no questions.
Okay, great. So let's start with the driving the last mile paper. Uh, why distracted driving? So if we look at the last 2015 data of just US, there has been like almost close to 70,000 crashes, which has been caused by distracted driving due to cell phones. And when you start looking at distracted driving, there can be very different types of distractions. There is a visual distraction, which is something like I'm driving, but I'm looking some other way. There is a manual intervention, which is I'm driving and let's say I take my hands off the steering wheels. And then there can be cognitive interventions, which is I'm driving, my hands on the wheel, I'm looking at the road, but I'm thinking about something else or I'm worried about something else. And using mobile phones while driving is one of the most dangerous forms because it involves all three. You are visually looking at your phone, one of your hands is at least off the steering wheel to hold the phone, and now you're also worried about making this reel or posting it on social media or thinking, what if you're texting, what should I write to this message? So cognitively you're away, which makes it one of the most dangerous forms of distracted driving. And it has been shown by studies that almost 50%, 42% of all high school uh, people who drive around in cars. This is US data where driving around in cars is much more common. Close to 42% people end up texting or using social media while they are driving. So it's a very dangerous problem with very real consequences. So based on that, the researchers tried to develop multiple research questions which they would want answered. Before I go into specifics of it, you would also see a very interesting trait in both of these papers about how do they go about building the research questions which they want answered. So I'm sure a lot of you guys do multiple projects, and one of the questions which would have came up in your mind when you're trying to do projects is, okay, how do I find a problem? and one way of that is find a problem which you have faced or you are looking around. But once you have that larger topic, let's say distracted driving, the way a lot of this can be distilled into finer problems uh, is an interesting approach with these two papers take, where they would go and look at a lot of old sociology and psychology literature which is present, which have studied humans behavior in, let's say, user studies in past, and then would say that, okay, can we take now these findings and see do they hold up in human behavior on online social media in these things also. So the first research question which they talk about stems from this old theory from Groffman in 1959, which talks about that people tend to always portray a idealized version of themselves in terms of a community. They would never talk about their flaws. They would always talk about in a very idealistic manner. And this leads us to asking this question of that, because if driving a fancy car or just the act of driving in itself in many countries can itself be a very pride thing, what is the extent of the something like this on these social media platforms? The second one then links with Goffman in this theory called edge work theory, where it talks about that males tend to do dangerous things more than females, or younger people tend to do it more than older people. And based on that, we root this question of that what are the demographic characteristics of the people who are creating posts, distracted driving posts on social media. And following that, we also talk about that at what locations these posts are being made and at what time they are being made, because they can have very interesting implications of trying to give interventions or how to probably stop something like that. Okay, so they take a larger topic, they find old literature, sociology and psychology, not necessarily computer science always, which roots how people tend to do these things, and see if we can now use computer science and social media to be able to validate, or if not validate, at least find these patterns again on a larger data set. Okay, so but more focused in this paper, we are worried about four questions of what is the extent of this, what are the demographic of these people, the spatial and the temporal analysis of it. So then we start talking about data collection. For that, they used a feature called Snap Map, which is a feature inside the Snapchat social media app, where you can post and post a snap, as it's called on Snapchat, or a short video, and that would be by definition geotagged. So it would be tagged for some location on Earth, which then can be tracked. Okay, so in total, when it came to started collecting the data, we collected data from 173 platforms, and we 173 cities, not from platforms, 173 cities across the world. And the way these cities was filtered down is that, you know, these cities should have at least 200,000 population. They should be one of the major cities in every country. That's how these 173 cities were filtered. And then what we did was, these 173 cities, for every given city, it was broken down into tiles of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer. So when we are trying to collect the data, we make a square of 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer in the city boundaries. And the city boundary can be taken from like a geological data, something like map my open maps. And we say that, okay, we'll collect all the snaps which are made inside this 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer tile every 8 hours. So every 8 hours, we'll go to every tile and connect all the snaps which is made between them, every snap which is posted. And eventually we ended up with 173 cities, and snaps from almost 64 lakh Snapchats were collected, so 6.4 million. And most active city was Riyadh, and most active day was 13th of April. So once we had this large data collection, the first thing in itself was that, okay, now these are all the snaps we have. How do we know if it's a distracted driving snap or something like something other? So for that, authors decide to make a neural network, and to make a supervised neural network identify this, you need annotated data, and for that, manual annotation were done by 3 annotators, where total 8,000 videos were manually seen, and they were tagged as are they distracted driving or not. And then two types of classifiers were trained: image based and video based. So, see, now we have videos which are snaps. There are two ways of treating them with a neural network. First is an image based network, where essentially you break a video down into frames, and for every frame you do a classification. Okay, and then you can essentially do voting, which is like, okay, I break this video into 100 frames. uh, for every frame I do a prediction, and let's say X percentage of frame, or let's say majority frames if are classified as distracted driving, I would call the video distracted driving. That is image based. And then video based is the neural network architecture itself is designed to be able to take in video as an input and solve it. The authors experiment with both of these methods, and then they train multiple networks, multiple different types and sizes of network, and what they eventually find out is that the image based networks with majority voting tend to perform the best in their case. Also, other networks were closely comparative, so that gives us a very good very strong family of models, which given now any video on social media, it can be classified as, is it distracted driving or not, and that becomes the very basic bedrock of any analysis we do forward in the paper. Any questions till now?
So, why can't the video be converted into frames as images?
It is, and that is what a image based classifier does. We take the video, we convert it into frames, and then every
Okay.
frame is passed to a neural network.
And how does the video based happen? The second
Video
one?
based, so these architectures itself are based on video input. So the way there are different ways these architectures can work. So one of the ways this architecture would work is it would take videos, it would take um, it would take features extracted from different points in the video, and then would pass it through a sequential network, something like a LSTM. Okay, and then those LSTM would combine. So think of it like this: in image based, we are taking a lot of frames, and
Okay.
then we are getting output for each frame, and then are combining them using something like a majority voting. Whereas in video based, the process of combining the information which has been taken out from different frame is part of the network itself. Okay,
Okay. Yeah.
and the value there is that the network in itself can learn a non-linear function of how this voting needs to be done, rather than something like a majority voting, which is a linear function in itself. Okay.
Got it.
Yeah. And if you look at this, our video networks almost perform as good as the image based networks. The reason why I think the image based network may work a slightly better is because these are very short videos, these are not very long videos. And if it's a distracted driving video, there is not a lot of difference frame by frame by frame. So actually the image based network are much smaller compared to video based network, but because in the video a lot of information is just redundant, the image based networks are much smaller, and sometimes they can give you the equally good output, and sometimes even better because they are smaller networks, they don't overfit in this case. Whereas for like maybe a more complex problem, video based would be a better choice. Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah. So once we have a classifier built on this annotated set and it's working great, uh, first came down to, okay, let's figure out what is the extent of it. Okay, and for that what we did is, if you remember, we had 6.4 million videos. This classifier was used to predict if something is distracted driving or not for all of these 6.4 millions now, because the training was initially done only on 8,000, and what we find out is that 23.56% of all the videos which are uploaded in Snap during this data collection were distracted driving, which is almost 1/4 of all the content is related to distracted driving, which gives you a effect of how big of a problem it is. And further, when we look it at a city level, we see it in cities, Middle Eastern and Indian cities, so like Chandigarh, Amritsar, and Baghdad. This percentage of post distracted driving content can be as high as 35%. Whereas when you start looking at like North American cities or European cities, this percentage is generally much lower. And which gives us like an interesting observation of that where this distraction driving content comes from is very dependent on the geographical location or region. So regions like India or Middle Eastern, which are more developing countries, tend to have much more content like this compared to like more developed places like Europe or North America. Okay. Then once we had that, authors did temporal analysis, where essentially because we all the data which we collected was time stamped, they started looking at what is the different patterns in the timing when they are posted. And what they find out is that even though the proportion of distracted driving snaps posted compared to like all the other posted is more or less constant all across the day. So if there are 100 snaps are being posted, close to 20 to 25 would always be distracted driving. But the volume of snaps in itself goes up by almost 77% during the night, which is 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. So late in the evening to almost post midnight. And at that time, you also see that a lot of more incidents of this distracted driving are happening. Okay, so the second find out is that even though this distracted driving posts are being coming across all day, they tend to go up almost by 3/4%, like by 3/4 during the night times. And then now that we know that there is a big extent of these posts and they are happening during night time, there comes to be value in seeing where in the city they are happening. So if you remember, the authors collected this data using 1 kilometer cross 1 kilometer cross tiles. So now they started drawing heat maps of these tiles to see where are they concentrated. Are this coming from all the tiles? So let's say a city has 1,000 tiles. So is it the content coming from all the 1,000 tiles, or is it coming from some specific tiles more than other specific tiles? And if you start seeing this map, you see there are some red regions in all the cities, Delhi, New York, Riyadh. There are these specific red cities, and these are the places where most of the content is coming for, which gives us a fourth insight of that how a lot of this content is concentrated on very specific areas in a city. Okay, so now if you combine all of this together, you would start seeing an implication of that almost 1/4 of the content is distracted driving. Most of it is generated in the late evening to midnight, post midnight time, and most of it is created on very specific regions of every city. Okay, and these regions can be determined based on some other factors. Okay, so then if you remember, there was a RQ2 which talked about edge work theory, which talked about the dangerous activity participation as very much has been historically dependent on gender and age. And we in our first insight saw that this percentage can be higher in specific cities like Amritsar, Chandigarh or Riyadh, which are Middle Eastern or Indian cities, compared to North American. So we also came up with a feature which is the city in a developed country or a developing country, which has been classified by CIA. And we take other control variables, something like a population, something like population of the city. So what is a control variable? Control variable, whenever you are doing an analysis like this, is a very important thing, which is, let's put this example for a side and let's go to a more familiar example of something, let's say vaccines. Okay, so COVID-19 vaccines have been developed over the last 3 years. A lot of work has been done then. So let's say if you are analyzing if vaccine works, but in one group you gave vaccines to a lot of young people and you did not give vaccine to a lot of old people, and then you started seeing that old people kept on dying whereas the young people lived on, you would conclude that vaccine works. We gave vaccine to these people, they lived. We did not give vaccine to these people, they did not live. But you see a problem here, which is COVID seems to affect elder people much more than younger people. There was a probability that if you did not give vaccine to young people in itself, they would have still lived. And maybe vice versa can be true, that even if you would have given vaccine to these old people, some of them may not have lived. So the way to ensure if vaccine works or not is that the people who are been given vaccines should be of similar age in both the groups. So there should be some young and some old people in this group and some young and some old people in the other group also. So age is a control variable here which you need to control for. Similarly, whenever you are trying to do experiment like this, Essentially, the idea is that there can be things which can affect the outcome or analysis of the experiment which you are doing. And when you are trying to design an experiment, you should control for as many of these control variables as you can. And so some of the control variables in our case can be what is the total number of population itself of the town, what is how many number of Snapchat users are there in that town, okay, and for those variables are controlled during this while we perform this experiment. And the experiment here is we want to see a relation between gender and age and developed and developing countries versus how many distracted driving Snapchats have been made in that. Now, to collect gender ratio and age information, we use the latest available census data of all these cities, and we do a simple regression where the dependent variable is your gender, independent variables are the things like what is the male versus female ratio in that city, how many people are below the age of 20, between 20 and 40, 40 and 60, is the city developed or a developing city. And we perform these independent variables and we perform a regression to predict what would be the number of distracted driving snaps coming from that city. And these numbers which you see are the coefficients of that regression, and the chi-square test shows how significant these features are when we perform this regression. And the insight which you finally end up finding is that cities with higher male ratio are likely to have more distracted driving. Younger people tend to do more distracted driving, and developing countries tend to do more distracted driving. All of these are the features which have been studied previously in the edge work theory, but edge work theory was studied 50 years ago on a very small sample. But now suddenly we can look at 6.4 million data sample across the world and perform a computational study to see how does those human sociological phenomena pan out when it comes to distracted driving. Okay. Now, implications of this work is very vast. A lot of these implications can help in designing public policy or platform. So, for example, now that we know these are the specific areas where this distracted driving happens during this time, maybe more policing can be done at this time. We know that these are the regions and these are the demographic features who tend to do more distracted driving. So maybe more driving tests or maybe workshops to explain the dangers of something like this can be organized for those specific demographics. Okay, and these can be very useful information for city planners. At the same time, Snapchat as a platform can use the classifier which was built to when somebody start making a snap, they can detect if it's distracted driving or not, and they can maybe deter people that no, you are driving right now, we won't let you post this. And now that these won't get engagement, other people would be less likely to post similar content, and eventually the proportion of something like this can be reduced. And then finally, of course, like every other work, this work also has some limitations, and most of these representations are at these limitations are at a representativeness level, which is even though these experiments are a lot of things are controlled, some things like we only experiment on using Snapchat. The experiment was done during a specific period of time in specific cities. So there is a possibility that that 3 months we experimented with were more people were doing more distracted driving, and before that or after that people were doing more or less. But that can't be studied by our paper. But that is not a systematic limitation of this paper, that is more of a limitation of data, and at the end of the day every experiment has to be done in a contained amount of time limitation. But the framework itself is robust, and this framework can be taken to any platform, any city, or at any time of data, and the similar insights can be found out of that limitations. Yeah, that is the first paper about distracted driving. We saw that how there can be great harmful impact of something you do online, how online data can be used to quantify the extent and the when and where of these events, and how now that that when and where of these events is happening can be used to have specific implications for platform designers or maybe public policy maker to maybe do interventions in future which can prevent this harm. If you have any questions before we move forward, let me know. Great. So next we move on to talking about effect of popularity shocks on user behavior. So if you remember, the first paper we talked about was the harmful effect of online activity with an offline impact. This paper is more on the positive impact side of things, which was published in ICWSM 2022. And the idea is that a lot of people who are using social media gets viral at times. Popularity shock here, the more lingo term for it is getting viral. And some of these people get viral, and there must be some change in their behavior. And this virality can bring a lot of things. This virality can get brand advertisement, which can have a lot of monetary benefits. This virality gives a larger reach to the audience, which can create impact in the society by their voices. So there is a lot of desirability in having this large reach. But let's say once somebody got viral, how does their behavior change, and what is the benefit or loss of that behavior is to be seen, what this paper deals with. So first, before we start anything, let's talk about what is a popularity shock. So if we, let's say, take somebody's profile and we look at, let's say, number of views their post have been getting over time. So x-axis is time and y-axis is the number of views they got. We can build this time series graph, and you would see these spikes and dips in these graphs. But the first time we see like a disproportionate amount of spike. That is the point of time which we in this paper called shock type event. Now, of course, these are also peaks, but these peaks are not disproportionately bigger compared to this peak. And how do we decide if something is disproportionately bigger or not? We come to that later in the paper. But the idea is that first time when somebody get a disproportionate shock, we want to study this event. This is the event of interest, and we want to see how does their behavior change after this, and how does this change in behavior can affect things related to their content creator journey in future. Okay. So again, this paper stays on the same theme as the last paper, where the specific research questions they ask are all rooted in the past patterns of sociology or computer science which have been observed. So for example, the first question is about this 1999 study talks about that if people are posting online in a community, they are mostly posting for one of three reasons. The first one can be they are anticipating reciprocity, which is if I put good information today, hopefully tomorrow when I need good information, people would provide me here because I helped them today. That is the first reason. The second reason can be there is a sense of contribution. All of you would have helped somebody somewhere at some point in your life, and that leads to a dopamine hit in your mind. You feel happy about helping other people. So once you have this sense of contribution, you have an impact in the community that makes people feel good, and that's why that is the other reason why they can post on a platform. And the third one is reputation. Human societies are status driven societies, and if you're providing, let's say, a lot of information, you are active in a community, that can garner you a certain amount of respect, which is leverage which can be used for other things in life. So generally, if people are posting, they are posting because of one of these three reasons. And at the very core of it, we hypothesize that popularity shocks can help you achieve, once somebody is popular, these three factors can affect their decision of, let's say, how much actively they are posting in a community. And based on that, the first question of that, how does the posting behavior of somebody after they get a popularity shock changes, is to be studied. The second one is about operant conditioning. Operant conditioning is this very famous experiment which was done by Skinner in 1938, which talks about that the original experiment in 1938 was actually a biological experiment where they took mice and in the cage of a mice, they put two buttons, red and green. Every time the mice would press the green button, it would get some food. But every time it would press the red button, it would get a small electric shock. And over time, the mice just learned to press the green button again and again compared to the red button. Okay. So operant conditioning talks about that if you do an action which gives you a reward or a positive incentive, the agent or the person is more likely to repeat that action again and again in hope of rewards. Okay, and based on that, we talk about that because popularity shock informs is a reward. Uh, how does the content which got somebody popularity shock alters once they get the popularity shock? So maybe I posted something, that content got me a popularity shock. Now, how does my content change after? Do I keep posting the same content or different content? Okay. And then finally, all the good things which we talked about, like getting advertisement money or getting reach, is all solidifies as you have a more longer time period when it comes to having this popularity. Having popularity is one thing, but ideally somebody would want to sustain this popularity. And the question number 3 and 4 is about that, which is how long is the effect of this popularity and what can somebody do to, let's say, have this popularity long term versus having it and then almost forgetting it. Okay. So any questions here? Great. Based on this, now came to data collection. Now, the difference from the previous paper here is that previous paper was a very specific topic. We were looking for distracted driving. But here we want to see just people getting popular, and people can get popular in all sort of things. So when collecting data, it is very important to have a very random set of data or a representative set of data from the platform. So the way we ensure that in the paper is we start with 14 generic categories. So we browse the platform and we find very generic categories like, automotive, finance, food, self-help, books, clothing, XYZ. We take these 14 categories, and from the post of these 14 categories, we find like 43 popular hashtags. And then for each of these hashtags, we collect 4,000 posts. Okay. And once we collect this, it gives us 21,000 unique users. But now an argument can be made that there can be some bias in you choosing these 14 categories and 43 popular hashtags. So to add another layer of randomness, what we do is, for these 21,000 unique users, we find all the posts which these authors have liked. Okay. And now we also go and collect profiles of all the posts which have been liked. So let's say I am one of the people in 21,000 users. Now I liked a post of PK. So I go to PK and then I would collect all the posts which PK has made, irrespective of which category or hashtag they are coming from. So this is a way of snowballing through the platform. The idea is the entire platform is a graph. You want to get at some point in the graph and then you can keep expanding this graph. So my point of entry here is popular hashtags, but once I got popular hashtags, I find all the nodes which have posted through these popular hashtags, and then I find their neighboring nodes based on what they have liked, and then I also collect everything which they have done. And technically I can keep doing this and keep getting a bigger and bigger data set. In this paper, we only do it once because that provides us enough randomness for this experiment. But hypothetically, if I wanted to collect more data or if I wanted to add more randomness, we can keep doing it for again and again recursively. But after doing this process one time, what we found out is we had 30,000 unique users, almost 31,000 unique users, and 18 million unique posts, which were done between January 2015 to December 2021. Okay. So now that we have this data, and the data here is for all these 31,000 users, we have all the posts they have ever made, on what date they made a post, and what is the number of views that post get. So we can essentially build this XY axis timeline for them. Now that this XY axis timeline is built, we want to be able to detect this first shock. How do we do this mathematically is by devising this algorithm. Now, if you think about it, in this timeline, there are two valuable features which a shock need to have. First one is, as we talked about, which is very clear, that it needs to be a relatively high value. So let's say if I was getting a lot of shocks before, it needs to be like maybe 10x, 100x or 1000x of the views I was getting before. Then only it's a shock effect for me. If I was getting 10 views before and now I got 20 views, it's not a shock for me. if I got 10 views before and now suddenly I got 1,000 views, that is a shock for me. So it needs to be disproportionately high. But there needs to be a second property also, which is absolute threshold to avoid false positive base effects. Which is, think of it like this. I was only getting one view and now suddenly I got 100 views. Now technically it's a 100x increase. But if you think platform level, think Instagram, Snapchat, TikTok, whichever platform you can think of, 100 views is not a lot. It is not going to get me viral. It is not going to get me any reach. So any shock detection algorithm needs to have both of these. It needs to have disproportionately high number of increase in views. So the person who is receiving it, it's a shock big enough for them that they change their behavior. If somebody who usually gets 10,000 views, if suddenly they get even 11,000 views, even though absolutely big number, is not a big enough shock to change the behavior. But the number needs to be absolutely big enough also to have a platform level impact. So it is of some value to the platform. So we come up with an algorithm which tries to do the exact same thing, try to replicate both of these properties, which is we take the timeline and we break it into different bins. These bins can be number of views somebody got this week or this day. So this can be as small as a day or an hour, or as big as like as much as you want. So there is a bin size. In our case, the bin size was a day, which is we look at the number of views they got every day. Okay. And then shock is just a flag variable, which in the start of the function we set at -1, and we calculate the total number of bins. So let's say if the bin size is 1 day and we have the timeline is 200 days long, so we have n is 200. And then we also have a variable called running average, which is what is the average number of views in the past somebody has got. If we take every bin, we sum the number of views somebody has gotten in all the bins, divide by total number of bins, that gives us running average essentially. And then we start iterating through these bins one by one, and we calculate a ratio which is number of views in this bins versus the running average. And we also calculate the difference between the absolute value of the views and the running average. And now we say, so now if you think about this ratio, by dividing these, we are actually capturing percentage increase in the views, whereas the absolute difference gives us the absolute threshold. And we are saying as long as this ratio and this difference are above a parameter called theta or neta, we would say that shock has been received. Otherwise, we'll keep looping through this. Okay. And the way you decide these parameters called theta and neta is ideally the way you would determine the value of theta and neta is you have all the data which has ever been posted on the platform, and then you can come up with a systematic thresholding. But since our case we only have limited data, to ensure the robustness of it, we experiment with multiple values of theta and neta. So we take percentage increase from going from 10x to 1000x. We take absolute number from as small as 10,000 views to as large as 1 million views or 10 million views. And we experiment with all these parameters. So based on change on the parameters, people who were detected as shock gets changed, and then we see what is the change in the behavior, and we see if this change in behavior is consistent across different values to ensure robustness in the experiment. Any doubts still here?
No.
Okay, great. So once we had this algorithm, of course, we wanted to see if this algorithm works well, and the way it was done is we took timelines of random 100 users and we showed it to people who use the same platform very often, and we showed them that imagine this is your timeline. If you were looking at this timeline, this was your timeline, at what point you would feel that you have received a shock. They don't have to do any mathematical calculation, they don't have to do anything. Just imagine this was your timeline, at what point you would feel like, array, I've gotten a shock, like I've gotten viral. Okay. And we make every timeline is been annotated by 3 different manual annotators independently, so we can ensure that there is quality of annotation and it's not biased. And the way you judge this quality of annotation is this score called Fallis-Kappa score, which we got of 0.6, which indicates a moderate agreement, which for a task like this is very good. because if everyone is believing, everyone won't believe at the same time that they have gotten viral. Some people's measure of popularity is different than other people's measure of popularity. It's a very subjective thing. So a 0.6 of moderate agreement is actually a pretty good agreement. And once we had this manual annotation, we did prediction using our proposed algorithm, which is this algorithm we talked about. But we also took some famous anomaly detection algorithms like ZSOR and Profit, and we calculate accuracies, and we see that the proposed algorithms work best most of the time. The reason it works best compared to Profit and Z-score is that Profit and Z-score actually account for the first property, which is percentage increase in view, but none of them include the second property, which is absolute threshold, and that is why they tend to classify a lot of false positives. Okay, so we now have a shock detection algorithm which works pretty well. So now in all this data we collected, we can actually determine who are the people who got a shock and what was the exact point where people got the shock. Okay, so once we determined that, we wanted to see, if you remember, the RQ1 was about, we wanted to see how does the posting frequency in itself change. And for that, we use this causal inference method called regression discontinuity design, or RDD as it's called. And it's a very interesting method of causal inference. So, first of all, let's break down. Does anyone here know what causal inference is?
No.
No. Okay. So, okay. Let's pause here for a second. I will go back into, I'll take 5 minutes to explain some background of causal inference, because it's a very interesting theoretical topic in this area to know. There is a lot of value of doing that in the projects you would do, and it would help you understand the paper also better. So, causal inference simply is just saying that we want to see that if something has caused something. So, for example, let's say I make an argument of going to a top tier college leads to better salaries. Okay, so now how do we prove that? We want to make a causal edge between these, that this is actually causing that, and that is called causal inference. Sometimes you can just see correlation, which is something like who all are the people who have been to these top colleges and what are the salaries which they have received, and let's look at the average salary, and if we are seeing it is high, then we can't 100% say that is the cause. There are a lot of other things which can determine somebody's salary. Okay, or there can be a lot of other impacts like this. So a lot of times you would see these false correlations which can make somebody confused. A great example was the vaccine example which you talked about. If you don't control for the age, you would think that vaccine is correlated to death. It is, and in fact it is in that experiment correlated to death, but it's not a causal impact because you did not account for the a control variable. So there are different algorithms which can help you establish this causal analysis. Okay, RDD is one of them. There is propensity score matching, there is survival regression, and there are a lot of others. The depth of what exactly and how do they work is out of the scope of this course right now, but at different times in the coming weeks we will try to give you a glimpse of how these work in different papers. Okay, in this paper we'll take a glimpse of RDD. RDD is a very interesting method where you are interested in, there is a timeline or there is a sequence of something. It doesn't have to necessarily be a timeline, and at some specific event some change happened. Okay, and now you want to see, was there a effect of that point in time. So if you imagine in our case, the timeline is the number of views somebody is getting. At some point in this timeline they got a shock. Now we want to see that after this point and before this point did something change. Okay, the way I would operationalize this using, let's say, the college example which I gave before is, let's say you take a standardized test score, so SAT score, or let's say JEE main scores. Okay, and you say that we find the cutoff, because generally these standardization tests would have a hard cutoff, which is uh, let's say if it's a 100 marks exam, anything which is above 70 gets you into a top tier college, anything below 70 does not. So what you would do is, you would, on x-axis, you would have the marks which are received by people in that standardized test, okay? And now the point of discontinuity, the point of interest would be the line at 70. And then maybe 20 years from now, you look at the salaries of all these people and you plot it on y-axis, okay? And if you suddenly see that the value, there is a significant difference in the value at the point of 70, you can claim. So imagine this line, imagine this graph which you are saying. If imagine this 0 line was the 70 line, and these are the salaries before and these are the salaries after, there is a stark difference between here. This stark difference now suddenly shows, and assuming you are controlling for other variables like which can affect salaries, like in which field they are working, how many years of experience they have had, stuff like that, then you can say that, okay, the cause of this discontinuity is this line at 70, which is which college they went to, okay? So this is what regression discontinuity design does. So you take a point in time where you are interested, you do the regression of data before, you do the regression of data after, and you see if the two regression lines, which are these black lines, are they connected or not. If these lines were more or less connected, you can't say that there is any difference before and after. Is this clear? Is there any doubt in what is the concept of RDD?
Yeah, it's clear.
Okay, great. Given that, we started doing RDD for number of posts which somebody is making. So now that we know at what bin they got a shock, we looked at 15 days before and 15 days after, what is the number of posts they are making. So how many number of posts they were doing before, after, we do a regression model for before data, after data, and as you can see in this case, there is a stark discontinuity here which is statistically significant. And this shows us that yes, people are suddenly posting more once they got a shock. But we also see that this line tends to wither down after some time, which shows us that two observations, which is yes, users increase their posting behavior after the shock, but this increased behavior is very short term and eventually it quickly decays off, and eventually people start posting less and less again. They lose the motivation or something. What is the cause of it, we don't know, but it tends to go down. Okay, so that was the first question answered, which is what is the posting frequency change. Then there is the second question, which is more about operant conditioning, which is this type of content got me the popularity shock. Now would I keep continuing the same thing or would I change? Okay, and for that now we want to look at what is the similarity in content. Okay, so for similarity in content, we decided to take whatever the text caption which is written with each of the post. There is some pre-processing done, which is let's remove the hash from the hashtag and stuff like that, and we try to compute the similarity between the shock content and the content posted after. So let's say I made a post yesterday which got shock. I posted some content today. I take both pieces of content, I take their text, do some pre-processing and match how similar they are. And for matching, we use dense embeddings. So in the previous lecture of this week 11 only, we went through the linguistics paper, and there Prashant would have talked about things like word to vec and things like BERT, which is used to encode text. We use a similar model called doc to vec to encode, find the embedding of a text, and then we just calculate the cosine similarity between these posts. And what we see is two very interesting things, which is irrespective of the intensity of the shock or how much affected somebody's posting frequency was, the content which is posted later were more similar to the shock content compared to content before. However, you remember this discontinuity? The larger this discontinuity is for a given user, more similar content they would post. So irrespective of the size of this discontinuity, the content posted here is more similar to this line versus the content posted here. However, the bigger this line, the more is the similarity. The magnitude of similarity is a proportional factor to how big this discontinuity is. However, does not matter what size it is, there is always an increase in similarity in before and after. Okay, that is what we see. How we do that is we take post captions, we find an embedding of them using the dense NLP methods, which can give us a dense embedding, and then we use cosine similarity. And then we come to the important question of sustainability, which we talked about is, yes, the posting frequency has changed, posted content has changed, but what's important is how somebody's life changes based on something like a shock is how long they can sustain that popularity shock. And for that, we want to see the sustainability of it. So what we do is we look at what are the different actions somebody can perform on the platform, and we see how does these platforms causally related to the amount of time somebody received in shock. And for that, the way you do it algorithmically is using this another causal inference method called Cox proportional hazards, or it's more generally is also called a survival analysis method. The exact technicalities of this method I won't go into in this lecture. If everyone is interested, we can do another lecture talking about the exact mathematics of it. But at a larger level, what it does is it takes the different covariates which we want to look at. It, while controlling for all the variables, it will do a regression and which tries to predict how long something would last. So how long the shock would last. And the better predictor of the length the covariate is, the more effect it has on something. Or a better way of looking at it is, let's say for a given covariate, for every unit increase or decrease in that covariate, how much the length of the thing I'm interested in changes. So let's say if I'm talking about average likes, for every unit increase in the amount of likes I receive, how does the length of the popularity I would receive increases or decreases, is what Cox proportional hazards tries to measure. The way it does mathematically is out of scope of this, but this table shows us the results of that. And what you need to understand here is this value, if this value is bigger than 1, it means that it is reducing the length of the shock. And if it is less than 1, it is increasing the length of the shock. So we look at different things like what is the number of likes and engagement this person is receiving, what is their posting frequency, what is the similarity between the content consecutive and similarity of content post shock. So there is a very important distinction here: similarity between consecutive posts, similarity of post with shock post. So if we go back to this line, let's say imagine there are 20 posts made here in this red area. Similarity between the consecutive post is, I measure the similarity between 1 and 2, 2 and 3, 3 and 4, 4 and 5. The similarity with the shock post is, what is the similarity of 1 with this line, 2 with this line, 3 with this line, 4 with this line. Okay. So the first one is telling us what is the repeatedness in the content, and the other one is just telling us how similar it is to the shock area. And what we start seeing is, first of all, for most of the people, these shocks don't last very long. They generally just tend to die out. However, people who tend to keep their posting frequency higher, they keep constantly posting, they have a lot of engagement with their audience, they keep getting likes, they keep writing comments to on the post, keep replying to comments, and they maintain a critical balance in similarity, which is, if you see, similarity with the shock post is less than 1, which means that it actually increases your survival. However, similarity between consecutive was very bigger than 1, which means it's decreasing the survival. So how are these two things opposing each other? Both are similarity in content. What is happening here is that you need to maintain similarity of the content with the content which made you popular. Okay. However, you need to have some diversity in the content also, Otherwise, your content become repetitive and people leave. So imagine I have a car today and I posted a piece of content about that car which got popular. Now, I would have to keep posting car related content. If tomorrow I start suddenly talking about food, many people may leave because they came to my Instagram ID or my TikTok ID or my YouTube channel to look at car related stuff, not food related stuff. So I need to maintain this similarity with the shock post. However, if let's say I posted about one specific car and I keep posting about that same car one after the other, one after the other, one after the other, people would get bored. At the end of the day, there is only so much you can see about that car and people would leave. So I would have to have some diversity, which is maybe one time I'm talking about different aspect, other time I'm talking about different aspect, maybe sometime I'm talking about a different car in itself. So there needs to be some thematic similarity which made you popular, but at the same time there needs to be enough diversity so people don't get bored. And as long as somebody takes care of all these factors together, the popularity actually lasts very long. Okay. Now, what is the implication of some work like this? So, if I summarize what we have done, we figured out a way to detect a shock. Once we detect a shock, we looked at how does the posting frequency change, how does the content of what people are posting changes, and what actions lead to a longer sustainability of this shock. So these can have implications for all the stakeholders in this pipeline. So the first one is, most of the time people are doing content creation to either have a generate, let's say, money, which comes through advertisement. So now advertisement agencies can look at all this data, who is getting a shock and what are the behavior of these people after they got the shock, to actually identify which are the people who would sustain this popularity for longer, and based on that provide advertisement. Platforms' job is to actually increase engagement. If you are today owner or designer of a XYZ platform, you are trying to increase engagement. So now you can find out users who are either dormant or who have gotten a shock, and you can look at their behavior and you can provide them nudges or interventions on the findings of this, which would help them sustain their popularity for longer. And similarly, let's say if you're a content creator, you can just look at all these things which this paper has found out and go and implement that in your content strategy once you have gotten a popularity to sustain it for longer. There is an important critical point here, which at nowhere in this paper we talk about how to receive a popularity shock. There has been a lot of work done in that area of what receives a popularity shock, but that is out of the scope of this paper. In this paper, we are only talking about once somebody got a shock, what can they do to sustain it and what is the changes in their behavior. So users who have gotten a popularity shock can actually take actionable insights from this paper and implement them in their content strategy. And then there are limitations. There are limitations like that, of course. These shocks are many a times induced by recommendation algorithms, which are specific to platforms, which we do not have a way to account for. Even though we use a lot of techniques to ensure that the data which is collected is random, it may still have some bias. And finally, we are assuming that inherently that every shock is positive. An argument can be made that if somebody, let's say, posted something very wrong, that would also get a lot of views, but that is a lot of negative hate, and that may change somebody's behavior differently. Right now, we don't account for if the shock is positive or negative. We just account for that shock has been received. Okay. Yeah, that is it. Do we have any questions before we move forward?
I just had one question.
Yes.
So in the limitation part, right?
Yeah.
Can this be a limitation that sometimes a content posted that has been seen by a popular entity on
Yes.
that platform,
Yes.
and he replies to it, and due to which there is a shock, and there is a sudden increase in views of that particular post. So can that? Yeah.
Yeah. That is a very correct assessment, but however, that is a cause of the shock. And as I mentioned in the paper, we never care about what is the cause of the shock. We just care about shock has occurred. Once the shock has occurred, how did something change? Yeah.
No, but this thing will have a different behavior to the post creator, right? Because
Yes. but we don't, in the right now, the random data which has been collected, uh, the shocks can be generated by different mechanisms. They can be algorithmic, they can be what you have said, uh, they can be something else. Right now we don't account for one specific kind of shock, we collect shocks on random. So an inert assumption has been made that whatever mechanisms of shocks which exist, all of them are somewhere present in the data set, and the implications which we are finding out are across these different types of shocks. But however, your point is correct that we don't have a way of ensuring it, and ideally that would be a control variable which we would like to control. But the way the data is provided by these platforms, there is almost no way to control for that practically when designing an experiment.
Got it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but that's definitely a valid point that ideally we would want to control for what kind of shock, how did was this shock received, but that's just not possible.
Got it.
Okay. So before wrapping up, to summarize, we started with talking about a general phenomenon of online offline, where we talk about that online actions can have offline impacts. These impacts can be good in the sense of that they can provide popularity, they can provide reach, money, but they can be bad in terms of they can lead to injuries. And then for both the aspects, the good aspect and bad aspect, we looked at two papers, one on distracted driving, one on popularity shock. The common things in both of the papers is that both papers are trying to quantify the effect of online action in offline behavior. What are the things causing it, and how does it affect user behavior later on. In case of distracted driving, we are trying to look at who are the people doing it, and in case of shock, we are saying how do these people's behavior change what's is done. But the aim is to quantify that impact and then be able to suggest interventions of either public policy or for platform policy of how can more desirable outcomes can be achieved. uh, the non-technical part here is the commonality of using techniques like causal inference, and how old like previous sociology data can be used to take inspiration of what computer science research should be done and in what direction it should be taken. Different causal inference techniques which are common among both of these papers, and of course the thread of online offline is common among these papers. uh, but yeah, that is it. Thank you. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to take them.